26th of 2016 that allegedly approval by Hillary Clinton on July 26th, a proposal from one of her foreign policy advisors to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by Russian security services. Mr. Brock, in your testimony, you talked about the unequal application or the unequal treatment by the FBI of the Clinton campaign versus the Trump campaign. To me, this is just exhibit A in that unequal treatment. Here you have the intelligence community actually knowing that it's Hillary Clinton approving of a plan to stir up this scandal, tying
it's happening, America,
candidate Trump to Russian collusion.
Hillary.
That kind of explains the whole Steele dossier, doesn't it? And the FBI knew that was bought and paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign. The FBI knew that the primary subsource of that Steele dossier had been investigated by them in 2009. But they knew all of this for sure by the end of January 2017, but some of this information was known in July and in October. So speak a little bit in terms of the unequal treatment of the two campaigns. And also I want you to speak to, I agree with you that this was not an adequate predicate for an investigation, okay? But speak to the FBI guidelines about continuing an investigation when you have all this exculpatory information.
I think one of the
Again, get the microphone closer to you.
One of the most puzzling aspects of this whole really is kind of a national tragedy. It's a tragedy for the FBI, certainly, as we look back and see the thin basis for launching an investigation like this. When you juxtapose the reasons that the FBI stated in their opening communication for starting up a case, and then their comments to the Inspector General later as to why they felt they were compelled to investigate the Trump campaign, they don't add up with a certain logic that should have been applied.
Hillary's going to jail.
The dossier and its connection to the Clinton
Comey's
campaign.
going to jail. McCabe's going to jail.
If they applied the same logic
Maybe not Bill.
to the dossier and the fact that the Clinton campaign arranged for and paid for that and
By the face
received
look on
Russian
his face, he
disinformation,
knows she
then
did
they
it.
would have
Yeah,
had to
he does.
Bill
open up
Clinton was never
a
part of
separate
it. I don't think.
counterintelligence investigation, and yet they
I think he
didn't.
knows about
And quite
Galenian.
honestly, close down the Trump investigation
Well,
because it was predicated on all that false information.
it was predicated not only on thin information of fourth-hand hearsay, it also, the statements that they relied on contained two exculpatory statements that there was no indication that the Trump campaign received or accepted the Russian suggestion that they had information damaging to Hillary Clinton, and B, the Russians were prepared to release it no matter what the Trump campaign did or not. That is in their own opening EC. That right there for an experienced counterintelligence leader in the FBI should have been enough to say, we don't have enough to open up a case.
So I want to address my next question to the two journalists.
Overarching body that dictates how this stuff has to be handled.
As I've been trying to conduct these investigations over the last 6 years, one of the things I've certainly determined is it's an inquiring press
6 years.
that has access to sources that won't come to Congress because they don't trust Congress to keep their identities secure, confidential. So they go to the press. So the press finds out about this stuff a lot sooner than Congress does, or quite honestly, Department of Justice officials. So I fully understand and fully support a free press and any member of the press protecting the confidentiality of the sources, but that's when they're giving them true information. Mr. Smith, is there an obligation to protect a source that has given you false information?
Yeah, but I don't think it's.
Turn on your mic and get it close to you.
Yeah, I see it a little differently. I think that what we've seen, as I tried to describe in the opening statement, is an actual partnership between the press and people who are providing false information to prosecute a campaign against the Trump administration. I'm very familiar with the left-wing bias in the media. My family, father, grandfather, great-grandfather all worked in the press. I was the literary editor at the Village Voice, which was the first alternative weekly in America, co-founded by Norman Mailer. I come from the left. I'm familiar with left-wing bias. What we've seen the last several years has nothing to do with left-wing bias. This is not about partisanship. What we've seen is something very destructive and very dangerous. And how this started was, in part, because of the financial collapse of the prestige press, which began with the advent of the internet. We've seen as a consequence the moral and professional collapse of the press. What we're talking about now is not a normal media. It is a platform for information operations. It's not just about partisanship.
Okay, Senator Peters. Maybe he has blinked off. So I will go to Senator Langford.
Blinked off.
Zoomed.
Oh.
A lot of them. are
Chairman,
zoomed.
thank you, or witnesses,
wanna
thank
come
you
in
very
there.
much for that. Mr. Smith, I want to go back to that last statement that you made about that journalism and media has become a platform for disinformation in many ways. How does that get turned around in your perspective? You've been around media your whole life. How do we get accurate information out? It's one of the top questions that I get asked by people in my state in Oklahoma is how do I find out the facts?
I mean, there are different, for all the different complaints that we rightly have about the internet and even social media, there are different trends that are happening as well. So of course there are different alternative outlets. There are different journalists, there are different sources for people to follow. If we're talking about our national prestige media, like the brands that I talked about in my opening statement, these brand names will continue to exist for as long as they have people who own them who do not care how much money they make. How to make these particular brands responsible and accountable again to an American public that needs sound information, I don't know. But I am telling you, there is real news out there. There are people who gather news and who disseminate news. And I think that those figures need to be encouraged. If you're talking about what people ask you back in Oklahoma, I would say that one of the central things is local news is very important. I'm not sure that anyone needs to be competing entirely with the Post or the Times or CNN. Local news is very important for people to make those decisions right there and to figure out what they're doing, and then the national news will get to them as well.
Thank you. Ms. Atkinson, I wanted to be able to ask you a question about what you experienced personally and what was experienced by multiple journalists. There's an AP story in 2018, actually September 2018. I want to just read a clip of this AP story. It was asking this question. It said, Trump may use extraordinary rhetoric to undermine trust in the press, but Obama arguably went farther, using extraordinary actions to block the flow of information to the public. The Obama administration used the 1917 Espionage Act with unprecedented vigor, prosecuting more people under that law for leaking sensitive information to the public than all previous administrations combined. The Obama Justice Department dug into confidential communications between news organizations and their sources. As part of that effort, went through and discusses the 20 Associated Press office phone lines and reporters' home phones, cell phones, seizing them without notice as a part of an investigation, and then went into what actually happened to James Rosen as well at Fox News. You experienced this as well at CBS. So my
News
question to you
anxiety?
is,
Yeah.
what should be done to an entity or an agency to hold them to account? Because they were never held to account for literally intimidating the press and for tracking the press and for investigating journalists
Eat
through this
Chick-fil-A.
process, tapping cell phones and such. What should be done in that situation to be able to hold an administration to account?
Well, at a minimum, one would think there would be an apology, and the people who took part in these actions would no longer be in a position that they could ever work in the government again and do these types of things.
Yeah.
But people see that nothing happened to them. You know, why should anybody change the way they operate? In my case, this was illegal action, so obviously they should be prosecuted. But who's the prosecutorial authority? The Department of Justice and FBI, who are the ones implicated. And since they're not going to do the job, you have somebody like me, just a citizen, trying to bring a case in court to force what the Department of Justice is supposed to do criminally, because they're not. And then they spend all this taxpayer money just dragging it out, fighting it, trying to get the court to dismiss the case. I think because there's no accountability time and time again, They may say, oh, people need more training, we'll reiterate our policies. This has happened over and over again, and they know, again, from administration to administration, some of the same people, nothing ever happens to them, so the behavior doesn't change.
That's right.
Mr. Bark, let me ask you a question as a follow-up to that. You've been around the FBI, been in the FBI, now retired from it. You still know a lot of agents, you know the process. What should and could be done to an agency or leadership or individuals when they have an abuse of power? How should the investigation be handled? What is missing, and why can't we seem to close the loop on these investigations?
Some of what we're talking about today may not rise to criminal activity, certainly violations of policy, departmental policy, violation of the Attorney General guidelines. The executives involved were all fired, and with good reason, with cause. So there was some accountability there. What this committee is doing, shedding light on the abuses that took place by this small kind of rogue band of executives at FBI headquarters is vitally important. This is not the FBI I knew or worked in. This is not the FBI agents who work tirelessly, and analysts and other support personnel who work tirelessly every day for the good reasons that the FBI exists. This was a hijacking of the FBI, given respect to the Inspector General's conclusion of no bias. It's clear that there was bias involved by the text messages that were written by Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. It's clear by the statements made by former Director Comey and Deputy Director McCabe. They held a personal animus toward the president. There's no dispute on that. So this investigation was clearly a malicious undertaking.
Yeah, I know a lot of great FBI agents that they're frustrated, disappointed, and quite frankly embarrassed for how leadership handled some of these investigations. They don't do it this way, and their statement over and over to me is, if I did as a line agent what James Comey did as a leader, I would have been fired and should have been fired. But they seem to be held to a different account than what leadership is being held to account in this. I do want to ask you one quick follow-up statement. I think I know your answer on this, but I want to get clarification. James Comey said in his September 30th testimony before Judiciary that he was proud of the work done by Crossfire Hurricane. That was the investigation on President Trump, at that time Canada Trump. And for the most part, it was done by the book, was his word. And I think for a lot of us, we were most shocked by his two words, proud of it, and it was by the book. Would you agree with either of those statements?
Well, I wouldn't be proud of Crossfire Hurricane. I'm proud of FBI agents, but no, this was not done by the book, not even remotely. We keep saying it over and over again. The FBI cannot walk outside the door without articulating adequate predication to be able to interview a U.S. citizen. And we should all be concerned and vigilant that the FBI adheres to those policy guidelines. And in this case, they did not.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I want to thank you, Senator Langford, Senator Scott. I think Senator Hawley's on by remote for attending this. I think this is part of the problem. I think you all understand that I've not gotten a great deal of support for these investigations over the last 6 years. I think the attendance of this hearing shows that. And what I tried to point out with the lack of accountability of Eric Holder being held in contempt of Congress. Congress is a paper tiger. The reason these people aren't held accountable is there's no way to hold them accountable. Who investigates the investigator? Who prosecutes the prosecutors? That is an enormous problem. And it's certainly what I've come to understand in the 6 years trying to do this, trying to get this out. Obviously, the bias in the media, the attacks that I've had to put up with. It doesn't bother me personally. It bothers me in terms of the reflection and the impact on our democracy and on our freedoms. This is serious. And yet, we've got a couple senators attending this hearing. And I've got my ranking member saying this isn't even an appropriate hearing for this committee to have. There's the problem. Senator Scott.
Microphone.
believe Americans care about corruptions, and I believe that Americans do not want to see their president involved in corruption. I believe all along that we need to have a thorough investigation of Hunter Biden and his relationship in the Ukraine. I believe the public needs to know how Vice President of the United States was able to stop a foreign government from investigating a company that was paying his son $83,000 a month. And I mean, I think this is, I mean, whatever the facts ought to come out. So, Ms. Atkinson, what have you learned about Hunter Biden in the Ukraine? Number one. Number two, why hasn't the mainstream media cared? And assuming that Joe Biden will become the next president of the United States, will they start caring?
I have not done as deep a dive into the Hunter Biden question as other journalists who have written really good pieces, including left-leaning publications starting about a year ago this time. We're doing some great investigations, and I think that can be attributed to the fact that at the time there must have been people putting out the narrative, as I say in the news, that did not want Joe Biden to be the nominee or wanted somebody else. So therefore, even among left-leaning political figures and so on, this was debated. But then once Joe Biden became the nominee, it evaporated, at least as a discussion among the liberal press and left-leaning figures, and it became supposedly a conspiracy theory by conservatives at that point, although it was quite well documented and covered previously. I learned that there are, at the very least, some very legitimate questions to ask about conflict of interest and potential conflict of interest. I learned that if you substituted the name Biden and Trump, or Trump's children and Biden's children, I think you would undoubtedly have a very different kind of media coverage than the lack of interest and the advocacy that comes from some of the media that are trying to squelch the story and the discussion of it, aided by social media and powerful interests who don't want it talked about. And do I think it will change under a Biden presidency? I don't think so. I mean, I think there will be some criticism in the popular press of Joe Biden when he comes under criticism by others in the left-leaning, again, press or political figures. Maybe he's not doing the right things, but he's certainly not going to come under the same sort of scrutiny or attacks or the one-sided coverage that President Trump got. And I've written books about this, showing that the false coverage, not just the biased coverage, but the media mistakes made all the way from the New York Times to the Washington Post and to CNN over and over again, just false reporting and false information. I don't think we're going to see that. I think in the campaign, that was demonstrated that we will see a whole different kind of news coverage with Biden for reasons that I've explained. With news organizations, I agree with Lee, now largely taken over by narratives and propaganda. We've invited these special political and corporate interests to use us for their talking points and their distribution of narratives and storylines, and by and large, that's what many of us have become.
So Ms. Atkinson, how can somebody who believes they're a legitimate journalist like Wolf Blitzer or Jake Tapper not care about this? I mean, they've portrayed themselves to be legitimate journalists that want to get to the facts, hold people accountable. They're very clear they want to hold both sides accountable. How can they continue then to not care about something like Hunter Biden?
Well, I worked at CNN back when it was a news organization back in 1990-93, and we wouldn't have dreamed of covering stories. I spoke to many former CNN insiders in the book that I just wrote. They're all horrified at the turn that this once very prestigious and fairly straight down the middle news organization has taken. And you have to understand, if you realize that the media landscape has now been successfully co-opted and we've invited them in, I say we've been infiltrated by these interests that want to turn us into these mouthpieces, then you understand that when you do that job, you put forth a narrative, even if it proves not to be true, that you are given promotions and attention, and your views are then amplified by the like-minded media and social media, and it feels like you're doing everything right. Your colleagues are patting you on the back, and it just sort of feeds upon itself. But it's evolved into a situation where it's not journalism as certainly as I knew it, and as I think many Americans, if you've been around long enough, thought of journalism. I think it's all being redefined right now and changed.
So take individuals like Jake Tapper and Wolf Blitzer, can they actually go back to becoming legitimate journalists again, or is it just the way it's set up with their producers and the way CNN works that it'll never go back to a normal investigative and a fair media outlet?
Well, a lot of people weighed in on that when I interviewed them recently, including former people who were executives at CNN and were there part of the discussions about changing the way CNN worked into what it is today. So I'm not an expert on this, but a lot of people think that it is not going to be able to go back to what it once was, even though there is a demand. Even people who want to get their left-leaning news from CNN and maybe their right-leaning news from Fox or somewhere else, they still want a place they can go that they feel is just telling you the story where it leads and more down the middle. But the people I spoke to the extent these are news executives who worked in the industry, they don't feel, if they had to guess, that CNN can go back to what it was, but they also don't think it survives moving forward without Donald Trump, the villain, in the way that it's been doing the last 4 years.
Ooh, without the villain.
Pretty quickly, we've had these hearings recently about Twitter and Facebook and places like that where they censor conservatives. So, and then they allow Ayatollah or Maduro, people like that, do whatever they want. What do you all think the impact that has on our democracy when a conservative can't have anything, say much on Twitter or Facebook, but Maduro in Venezuela, who's committing genocide against his own citizens, or the Ayatollah, or the Communist Party of China can do whatever they want? What do you all think the impact that is on our democracy and the ability of us to actually to do our jobs?
You'd like me to answer? It's laughable, of course. I mean, they have, Ayatollah Khamenei who tweets all the time, and he gets away with death to Israel, death to the United States. And the president of the United States, if you look at his Twitter feed now, it's 3/4 is censored. What's not censored is that it's marked with advisories. It's preposterous. People see this. I mean, this is the thing. This is getting through to people outside of Washington, outside of New York, outside of Los Angeles. People see it's a farce. They understand that not just the media. They understand social media. They understand that the game is tilted against them, and people are getting angrier and angrier. Do I care myself personally? I think it's obscene that they let Khamenei and they let the Iranian lunatics, the Islamic Republic, post whatever they want, and American conservatives are thrown off there for something ridiculous. It's laughable, right? But the serious thing is happening in the real world, off of Twitter. Americans are seeing what's happening, which is it's a blessing. That's a great thing.
May I say one thing?
Sure.
I feel like I've looked at this issue quite a bit, and there's danger in the notion that sometimes we say, those of us who don't like the censorship that social media is the heavy hand that they're now using, we say, why aren't you censoring this because you're censoring that? And I personally think as a journalist, the tack ought to be, don't censor anything except that which is illegal. In other words, don't invite them, don't accept that they have that role. They never had that role before 2016 when they were lobbied by political and corporate interests to do what I call our fake fact checks and to curate our information. They created a market or demand to let us invite that in because we weren't asking for it. And now that it's here, I think we have to be careful not to say, well, gee, if you just censor everybody equally, we'll be happy. I think the whole trend is bad for everybody and that the goal ought to be hands off of our information.
Where they had no evidence, they had exculpatory evidence, and they didn't lift a finger to investigate what was happening with the Steele dossier and the Clinton campaign. But Senator Hawley, the question I want to ask you, because I want to talk about the difficulty we have here in Congress investigating these things. The resistance I've had to getting documents, even out of the agencies under a Republican administration. You had the ability to interview both Mr. Comey and Mr. McCabe. And by the way, you did an excellent job with Mr. Dorsey and Mr. Zuckerberg, particularly because you had whistleblower information. You had documents, so you could ask them some pretty hard questions, some pretty revealing questions. My big problem in bringing either Mr. McComey, Mr. McCabe, any of these characters, is we haven't had the documents. Can you speak to trying to prepare for your judiciary hearing, interviewing both Mr. Comey and Mr. McCabe? I watched that. There was a couple interesting revelations, but because you didn't have documents, because you couldn't, ask them, well, what did you mean in this email? How much did that hamper your ability to actually question them when they were witnesses before your committee?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the stonewalling, and I think that's the only word that you can reasonably use here, the stonewalling by the FBI of both the Judiciary Committee and this committee in the investigation into Crossfire Hurricane and the origins here has absolutely hampered the investigation. Of course, that's been deliberate. I mean, they have withheld information from us. They've withheld documents. We've had to threaten. We've had to cajole. We've had to issue subpoenas in some cases. I mean, this is what you've been doing. So to not be able to have the source material. And I'll tell you also, we've been told over and over the Durham report. The Durham is handling this. Wait for Durham. Well, the Senate has an oversight responsibility of its own, and the public has a right to know. And when a presidential election has been interfered with, and when the FBI has been leveraged by a political party, in this case, the Clinton campaign in 2016, leveraging the FBI, the most powerful law enforcement body in the world, to interfere in a presidential campaign, and they successfully did it. That is something that the Senate absolutely must investigate and has a right to know. The public has a right to be part of that process. And I'm afraid they've been effectively denied by the FBI itself, which to this day is refusing to turn over key documents and stonewalling and slow walking. And that's why I say, Mr. Chairman, it is just confirmed in me the conclusion that the FBI needs pretty fundamental reform. And what Mr. Brock was just describing, a political atmosphere has clearly taken over in the upper echelons of the FBI, which is a great disservice to the field agents and the men and women who are out there on the line every day, enforcing the law, investigating, bringing criminals to justice. But you've got this political group in Washington, D.C., and what they're doing is dangerous.